Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Numbers. My name is Robert.
And my name is Nicholas, and we are your hosts.
Today we will try to discuss and explain the whole situation and the whole topic of Evergrande and what it could lead to.
Right, so let's get right into it. Before we start, let's just give in some key financial facts about the company, just to get you guys started and get you an idea of like a little history behind Evergrande. So, a year ago, the company's market value was around 80 billion US dollars. But in a span of a year, the market cap has halved, little more than halved into its from what was original market cap, from 80 billion US dollars to 31 billion US dollars. That's more than a half of its value gone.
Yeah, and this is mostly accounted to market share prices, which have fallen by 85.5% in this year alone. Well, most of this comes from the fact that it takes on a lot of risk, and with a lot of risk, well, obviously comes very high losses or very high profits. And the company is actually the most indebted real estate developer with over $300 billion in US debt. And in addition to that debt, Evergrande holds about $7.4 billion in bonds that are due next year. So this could be a very important situation.
Right.
And we'll
And a
explain why.
meltdown of the company could send China to a crisis very similar to the Lehman Brothers collapse, followed by the 2008 financial crisis. And for why? Well, if Evergrande were to collapse, then China would have to take the $300 billion debt. And that could affect the economy, or almost, well, guaranteed will affect China's economy. Now, what's the problem with Evergrande and the Chinese housing market? Well, Evergrande profited very heavily off the flawed Chinese housing market.
Yeah, and I can explain this a bit further. So what's the problem with the Chinese housing market? Well, when you look at investing, so let's start off broad. Investing. When you think of investing, there's three types of main categories of investing. You can invest into bonds, so that could be government bonds, corporate bonds, so any kind of bonds. Stocks, so equity, funds, ETFs, that kind of stuff. Or third, real estate. Now this one is key in China because this is the only one that really matters. Because if you look at stocks are very volatile in China and they're seen as a very risky thing that goes up and down. Bonds, they have too little returns. So when you invest into bonds, you don't earn as much. But real estate has just been going up and up and up ever since the 90s when it was semi-privatized. So this has led to companies like Evergrande trying to exploit this market and just building more and more of these houses and more and more and selling more and more of these apartments at more and more inflated prices. And this is very similar to the 2000s in America with the housing boom. It's just the bubble is just blowing bigger and bigger and bigger. Only with compared to America, China has 90 million homes that are empty. And for context, that's enough to house the entire nation of Germany with 7 million homes in extras. And this is a huge problem because most of the purchases of housing that happened, 89% actually, is actually second home purchases. So these are people buying their second homes. And this shows how big of a problem this is because people in the future generation, with the future demographic, are going to have a very hard time to buy into this market. And it's going to lead to a lot of people lending, taking out loans. And that's just going to lead to a whole lot of mess. And Evergrande is a big corporate behind of this. And that's just one of the reasons why the Chinese housing market is so flawed. That's just one. There's a lot more to cover, but we would have to talk forever.
And also to add on what I mentioned earlier, Evergrande is a very flawed company because of its very high risk strategy. And if housing prices fall or purchasing volumes drop, it could go bankrupt. And the real estate giant crashing down might bring down the Chinese economy and even potentially the world economy.
This can be followed up by an analysis that I think was done either in 2019 or 2018 by the World Bank and the IMF. So they said that a 1% decrease in the Chinese real estate market could lead to the global markets being affected by 0.25%. So for every 4% of the Chinese real estate market falling, 1% of the global market falls. So this could have, and for China, of course, it's going to be absolutely massive. If Evergrande default and they go bankrupt, that's going to be a massive financial crisis for China. I think in some cases even bigger than 2008. But as well for the world, this is actually a potential risk for the world as well. But what is the crisis?
Right.
NJ, can you explain?
The crisis is centered around Evergrande's debt deadlines and increasing fear that the company will go bankrupt. So the dues and the deadlines of Evergrande's debt is closing in, and they clearly might not be able to pay back the $300 billion debt they own. And if they're not able to pay back that debt in time, they will have to dissolve. They will have to, Evergrande will crash down and China will have to take over. And the impact of this is that's having a massive psychological impact on the global market, because investors that have invested into Evergrande, or people who hold bonds, are worried that, oh no, Evergrande's shares are halving in value and it's probably going to go bankrupt. Let's not invest. Like, everybody's panicking because this huge, massive business, real estate company in China is about to go down of a $300 billion debt. Everybody's panicking. I mean, this is one of the top 500 companies in the world in retail. And, well, such a big company crashing down can have huge ripple effects in the global market.
Exactly, and we can see this reflected because when this Evergrande crisis happened, actually global markets, the global stock market, went falling down. A lot of people were really worried and really skeptical because this was a really near call. I mean, this whole crisis started from Evergrande nearly defaulting on one of its loans, and it's one of many. I mean, if you look at their backlog, 300 billions are spread all across different deadlines as far as the end of 2024. So this could be a very long ride. And if you look at the stock right now, it's in complete free fall. It's just been falling and tumbling over this year, and now we see it going either up 10% or down 10%, and this just shows massive volatility. And I think this could lead to not so good outcomes, which we will discuss right now. So what can we expect in the future? Well, I believe there are two main outcomes that can be then further divided, which we will discuss and discuss and see what we think is the best one for the government, which one's the best for the world, and in general, what we think is going to happen. So the first outcome is that the company survives. The company survives its debt and it continues operations. It continues as usual and it pays off its debt, and it could survive this debt by having the Communist Party maybe helping them out, bailing them out in some ways and taking a stake in the company. Or the CCP might also bring in harder regulation. I think that no matter the outcome of this crisis, the CCP or the Chinese Communist Party are going to bring in harder regulation. They're going to try to regulate this market, and they're going to try to close off everything, and they're going to try to limit on this, because a financial crisis could be horrible for the Chinese dictatorship, that is. And the second main outcome is that the company defaults and goes bankrupt. This would lead that the government would most probably bail out Evergrande, with the Chinese taxpayer ending up paying the price. This would send China into a devastating crisis. This would be even worse than 2008 when Lehman Brothers collapsed, which followed the how many losses were there? The 7 trillion, I think it was, from the 2008 financial crisis. I think it's going to be even more from this if they go bankrupt, and national stocks and global stocks would just fall off a cliff. And I believe that this could send a massive ripple effect, as Nicholas said. It's going to send a massive ripple effect across the global economy, and it's going to hit the hardest in China. So now I want to discuss with Nicholas, what do you think is the most, which one do you think out of these will happen?
Let's be realistic here. A $300 billion debt for a company whose market cap value has been more than halved since the past year. I don't think realistically that this company will be able to pay back that debt. So most likely China will have to take over and pay back that debt. And then thus, as a consequence of that, the economy will, of course, be completely impacted and affected by this huge $300 billion cavity in its economy. And to add on to that, well,
Can I add something?
not much. You can continue. Don't worry. Yeah.
Yeah, I can add something. I mean, if you look at their debt, 300 billion, even more in some people think it's even more. If you look at their market cap, 31 billion compared to their debt of 300 billion, that means that it's a ratio of 1 to 10. And that means that if the company, theoretically, if it loses 10% of its assets, or 10% of their property drops in value, they'll go bankrupt because they'll have nothing to pay. They'll have no cash on the table. And this is very scary because 10% in this massive bubble that could burst any minute, 10% is pretty easy to achieve with enough strength and with enough, if the bubble bursts. If the housing bubble continues to rise, I think the company will most probably just be taken under the government. The government will come in, step in, and they will buy Evergrande. I think they will buy Evergrande. It will become part of it's going to become a government company, and the government will take control of it. So that's what I think is the most probable outcome. But Nicholas, how do you think this will impact the normal people? I mean, the people on the ground in China.
As I mentioned previously, Evergrande is a huge business. It has global reach towards every single corner of the earth almost, and almost 3.8 million jobs are indirectly sustained by Evergrande, and another 200,000 directly employed. If Evergrande were to collapse, were to dissolve thanks to this $300 billion debt, that's 3.8 million indirectly sustained jobs put at risk thanks to its collapse. That's 3.8 million people almost that could potentially lose their jobs, and another 200,000 people who will definitely lose their jobs, unless the Chinese government takes absolute care that all of these jobs are not impacted from the collapse of Evergrande. But who is the winner? Like who can also benefit from it? Who's not really getting affected by this crash? Well, the owner, I'm a horrible pronouncing names, excuse my pronunciation, Hui Kaiyan, the owner of Evergrande, he's the owner of Evergrande, and this should probably affect him. As the owner of Evergrande of a $300 billion debt, this should probably affect him. But in reality, it's not really going to do much. Like, even after this collapse, he will still be a very wealthy man. And from this, you kind of can, if you connect the dots, you can see that recently Evergrande has been quite reckless with their spending, right? Yeah, they've been very reckless with their spending.
For sure.
They haven't been thinking too much about their actions, and they had this almost mentality of just focusing on rapid growth, right?
Yeah, for sure, because they thought that the market was always going to go up. And in theory, it has for 30 years, but, all things come to an end. And I believe that this housing market cannot continue to go up. And it's getting out of China's control. I mean, if you look at the laws, if you ask people on the ground in China what they do, I mean, some people fake divorces to buy second properties. I mean, it has ballooned to the point where in some estimates put it that 1/3 of China's GDP, so gross domestic product, comes from real estate associated products. 1/3. Now imagine if the biggest company that creates real estate, or one of the biggest real estate developers in China, collapses. Even if they represent 20% of the market, that is still 6.6% drop in China's GDP.
That's a huge drop, yeah.
And that is only from the bankruptcy. That's not even counting the ripple effects, the job losses, the tax bailout that's going to follow that. I mean, this is just the surface. This is best case scenario.
And you also mentioned how one of the possible outcomes of Evergrande from this crisis is that the Chinese government can reach out, help Evergrande come back on its 2 feet, and try to recover from this. Do you believe that if that's the case, if this actually happens, that they stand up, they get back on their feet, they take serious responsibility of this, and they try to fix it? Do you think that Evergrande will return to its former glory, or that it's worth betting on? It's that it comes back into its former glory, that's gonna recover, or do you think that it needs more time to see if it actually is gonna get anywhere?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that's not really down to me guessing. That's down to what the government believes. If the government believes that this is enough, we don't want companies to grow with this much risk on the table and putting so much risk at the cost of the common people. So they might.
Right.
So it really depends. If the government steps in and they just bail them out, but they don't put any regulations, Evergrande might return to its glory, but at the same time, there's a lot of risk they're carrying. So that growth is gonna come at a cost that could be
Exactly.
chasing them.
And the leader Xi Jinping, sorry if I pronounce that, I'm horrible pronouncing these names. If the like we've discussed earlier, that Xi Jinping, he doesn't really care so much for the Chinese economy, seen as he's constantly taking down these private businesses in China and hindering their progress, their success, just to maximize his control over the common people. Do you really based on what we talked about like in that previous podcast, do you think that Xi Jinping will actually like allow it to come back on its feet? I heard you mention that the Chinese government is not going to really like take such a risk for the common people, and I can agree with you. It's quite unlikely that they actually do that, but there's always that small chance. I mean, of course, it's very likely that they're not gonna do much because of course, they already have enough control. They don't want to lose that kind of, upper hand over the people. And if they put too much risk into this company that's almost doomed to fail, I think they're gonna lose too much. It's not really a bet worth risking for.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think you kind of got it on spot there that Xi
Right.
Jinping is going to be very careful with this, but not only because he might lose control, but because people will look at him very negatively. In the public eye, you're going to see this man that has all the power in the world, basically. It's this top-down person, everything goes up to him. He has all the power. Xi Jinping has all the power, and people are going to get very negative opinions of him if he lets this crisis happen, if he lets this boil over, become too big, and I think the people are going to be very,
Right.
very mad at him. And I think if the company goes bankrupt, it's going to be very bad for the CCP because then it'll be so hard for them to hide all this growth, because then a lot of people are going to ask themselves, well, at what cost did all this economic growth come from? Because I'm a more skeptical person of China. I mean, I do believe that the only reason why China has grown out of poverty is because they were allowed to make money. It's because these first tier cities, Shenzhen, Beijing, Guangzhou, these first tier cities were allowed to make money, and they started up private businesses. And because Chinese people are very hardworking people, that's what they did. And they grow the economy, and it was the people that made the economy go forward because they wanted to live better, and they were a very skilled populace. So I believe that even though Xi Jinping has a lot of power, there's going to be a lot of negativity about him, and the public opinions of him are going to be drastically ruined if he lets
Yeah.
this happen. So I believe it is in everyone's interest. It's in the common people's interest, because they don't want to pay this tax bailout. They don't want to pay for a company going bankrupt because they were putting too much risk on the table. They had no control over that. The government should have stepped in. So it's in the common people's best interest. It's in Evergrande's best interest to stay on the good side, because they still want these loans, they still want to grow, and they still want to get richer. And it's in the CCP's best interest that this doesn't go bankrupt, because they still want to have face, and they want to have status, and they want to be seen as this person that can solve any
Right.
issue.
Yeah. So you could pretty much safely say that the CCP are just doing this to save face. They don't want to look like the bad guys. They don't want to look like, oh, we could have saved this huge company that has huge influence over all around the globe, but we just decided not to help out. And we're practically, indirectly,
Oh yes,
almost
for
a
sure.
cost to this because, of course, we limit people's growth. We basically make it impossible for private businesses to become rich and successful and such. So they would all basically look like the bad guys. And do you think that the CCP, that China might actually take advantage of this crisis? Perhaps try to make themselves look like the good guys by perhaps helping Evergrande get back, like I mentioned before, get back on its own 2 feet. Perhaps provide resources or money for them to get out of this huge debt. Do you think that China might take advantage of this crisis instead of actually suffer from it?
I think an advantage could be made here, but I don't think they're gonna use it in the way that you put it. I think they're gonna use this opportunity to try to not burst the bubble, but try to get things under control because things have spoiled out of control. I mean, if you look at prices for real estate in Shenzhen and some other cities, they're more expensive than Park Avenue in New York, and it's these common people that usually earn about, well, around $1,000 a month, even in first tier cities, and that's people that work office jobs. It's blue collar people that work delivery jobs or lower class jobs. They get even less. I mean,
Right.
this is a good chance for them to try to press the reset switch and kind of to try
Get
to
everything
cool
in
the
order.
markets, try to cool the real estate market because it's insane. I mean, the prices people are forced to pay to to afford these properties, it's insane. I mean, it's comparable to what people pay in New York, Manhattan, all these places, these really rich and very expensive places. But it's in China where, it's a country that's where the average person earns a sixth, 1/6 as much as a
Right.
average American.
It's very likely too, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be very likely for like a lot of people to suddenly go homeless because of the sudden increase in prices in houses, and probably many other factors could fuel this crisis, this problem. It's not just Evergrande; it's many other different kinds of factors: jobs, housing, food, like we mentioned previously in our other podcast. A lot of factors are also coming into play. It's not just Evergrande, but it's many different other things that can also fuel this slowly increasing in the rapid crisis, right?
Yeah, the real estate market is a massive problem that China has, and it looks like an unstoppable force. And it doesn't help the fact that the CCP or the Communist Party, their approach to dealing with things is to leave it until the
Yeah.
very last minute. They ferment problems until they have grown too big and then follow it up with explosive, rapid
Right.
action. I mean, just look at the gaming restrictions. They could have put in more light regulations. They could have taken it more slowly, but no. The problem has boiled over so much to the point where it has festered, and it needs to be dealt with immediately
Right.
and
these
harshly.
rapid actions, these rapid, forceful kind of responses to these big problems that have been going over time are also quite damaging, to the country and to people.
Oh yes, very much. I mean, if you ask the people on the ground, they very much disagree with most of this.
Right. They do, because like they are unlike people such as the owner of Evergrande or CCP, they don't get so direct, like their lives aren't exactly as directly influenced and impacted as the lower people like who work as the common people, the common folk in China. They aren't as equally as impacted as these common folk. And the difference, like the opinions, the points of views, and the feelings about this crisis are very different compared to these two. There are people who are not affected as much by this crisis, and there are people who are very affected. The common folk who might not be able to find housing, food might be increasing in price. They are unhappy with the governing of the CCP. I mean, there's a lot of unhappiness among the common folk, and not so much action taken by the people who actually can do something about this until the very last moment. And these actions taken by these people usually are very, harsh and forceful to the common folk.
Yeah, and I mean, if you let's crack the numbers here. Let's just do some napkin math here. If the average person in Shenzhen earns about $1,000 a month, that works out to $12,000 a year. Let's say they need about, and they want to buy a house, just a tiny house. Let's say 50 square meters. That's gonna cost them around, I think, 800, $900,000. I mean, in some cases, in some areas, and if you look at that, there's only one option a person like that has. They have to buy basically a dorm room sized apartment and have debt for the next 15, 20 years to pay off it. And this is someone that already earns only $1,000 a month, which is not that much money. And even if he goes on a very long term debt, so let's say it's 15 years, so he has to pay off the debt in 15 years time, he will still pay about 40-50% of his income just for that debt, for that loan. And he will have it'll be like this massive weight attached to his leg that will slow him down, because that little money he could be saving and he could be putting into investing into growing himself economically, it goes straight to real estate. And we're talking about the government that is supposed to be a communist government that's supposed to have social reforms and supposed to protect the people, when there's no reforms and all the money just goes straight to the top. And it's just embezzlement of funds.
I also want to touch about something that you mentioned earlier, was about one of the two outcomes. One of the outcomes, you said that the CCP might bring in harder regulation to ensure that this crisis, this thing, doesn't happen again. Do you think that this crisis, if the CCP brings in harder relegations to ensure that this doesn't happen again, do you think that this will affect other growing businesses in China? And do you think that people should still invest in Chinese companies, or do you think that it's better to hold off and just see what happens next?
Well, as we said previously in our previous episode of podcast, also check it out, link in the description. I believe that you should stay away from Chinese markets. Chinese markets it's a very volatile place, and as the Chinese people themselves have realized, the only stable place to invest your money is real estate. You shouldn't invest into a place that is so focused on real estate,
and in rapid
on
growth
housing,
too,
Yeah, because they want to appease other nations. They want to try to grow, but a lot of it's just false. It could be put in as even false lies. I mean, right now there's even some allegations of the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, lying and ranking China too high for where they actually are. And there's like a whole crisis with that, but we can discuss that maybe on our Friday episode. But I believe that if the CCP will try to come out for the harder regulations, it will impact the real estate sector. But I don't think, again, I think they're going to wait with this one, as they always do, and they're going to wait last minute until the problem has festered and it's near breaking point. Because the only time when the Chinese officials want to actually do something, it's when it impacts them. If they feel the impact, that's when they're going to do something. But the problem is that what the common folk feel and what the common folk have to live with is completely different. What these government officials with their Mercedes-Benz S-classes and their penthouses that they bought during the 80s market.
Right. I know.
I mean, this is horrible. And you have to remember, when people buy property in China, all property is government owned. So when someone buys property, they only own it for 70 years as a lease. Which is even worse, because that is a speculative market. That is, you don't have anything to rely on. You don't own anything physical. You don't own any land. It's just you buying a lease. And I think a lot of people already know what the problems with leases are. I mean, you have to pay money on it, and you don't own it, so you can't count it as your
Right.
own,
Yeah.
which is really bad because then people don't have to rely as a physical, as they can't claim it as their land because it just isn't. And land is the best way to give someone inheritance money. Real estate has been shown as the best way because it's something that grows, and it's something that you know in Western countries, in capitalist nations, you own it physically. So if something goes wrong, worst case scenario, you can use it and you can live in it. There's a physical asset attached to it.
Right.
But here in China, it's a highly speculative market. No one owns anything. It's just
Right.
people speculating, which is a really toxic environment. And as we have been taught from the 2008 crisis, these things don't lead to good events at all.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think we've reached the half-hour mark. Do you think we should continue, or do we think we should end here? Because I do have one question that we can talk about now, or we could bring to the next podcast, and that is, well, you know how the regulations, how I mentioned before, that the regulations were probably going to be harder and stricter, so that it doesn't happen again.
Yes.
Do you think that the companies, other, growing companies, do you think that they're going to be affected by these new regulations? Do you think it's going to be harder for these companies to grow? Should we talk about this in now, or? Yeah.
I say we talk about this
Right,
now
right.
because I feel like this is related to this.
So, do you think that these companies, these growing companies in the future will be harder affected?
Growing companies, do we
Well,
mean
everything within China,
within
you know,
China,
because
or do we
China-
talk about only
not
real
exactly
estate?
only real estate,
Or
because
what are we
China,
saying?
obviously, if they are forced to take over this company and to take this $300 billion debt into their economy, I think that they're going to be pretty focused on it to prevent that this doesn't happen again. And as we've seen from their previous actions, they're going to take these not very thoughtful actions, and are probably going to, like how we saw the 3-hour limit of gaming and.
Yeah, it's going to be a
Exactly.
very explosive, very sudden,
So do you
and
think
very
that
big
it's
change.
likely? Do you think that growing companies of any kind of form or structure, such as like real estate, or it could be a service provider?
I believe that real
Yeah,
estate will be
definitely.
hit hard. I think that real estate, there will be reform because the problem is growing, and as you can see, the CCP are trying to do something, but it's just all small actions that anyone can get around with. I mean, as I said, if you ask the people on the ground, people have been faking divorces just to be able to buy a third or fourth property because it's such a guarantee that it will go up. It's almost like free money in some cases. So why not put your money into real estate? And that's just going to make it go warmer and warmer and warmer. But what are the young people going to do? What are these young kids that need property are going to do in this highly speculative market where people around them have 3-4 properties and they can't buy anything, and if they want to buy one, they're going to have to compete with people that already have 2 houses, and it's going to go for $2 or $3 million.
The price is just going to continuously increase, and people who are
Yeah, this problem is a massive problem, and it's happening right now. This is a problem that's happening today, and I think when the CCP realize it's a big enough problem, that's when they will deal with it. And real estate is going to be the one that's going to be hit hardest. Private sectors, well, the private sectors are slowly already being kicked out. I mean, Tencent has been basically limited very harshly by this 3-hour limitation. I mean, let's look at the other regulations. With Alipay, again, breaking it up. This is all just to cut up, control, and to try to stop a problem.
right.
So I believe that this is going to be a very what the regulation is going to be. It's going to be very focused on real estate. It's going to be something very explosive and very big. It could mean that, for example, all real estate is now government owned, and so is the development of it, or something like that. I believe it's going to be something that's going to be very explosive. Or they feel like it's not the time yet, and they're just going to do something very small and very negligible, and I'm sure that the people will find a way around
I'm sure
it.
of that too. We've gone a little bit over our half-hour mark, so I believe we should end it here.
Well, I mean, I'm going to open the floor up. So do you have anything you want to add to this?
Well, I believe we've covered most of it. I don't think I have anything to add on. Yeah, I believe we've covered most of it. Yep.
Yeah, well, in that case, this concludes our second episode of Let's Talk Numbers, and
our
thank you very much for listening.
episode will be uploaded on Friday, next Friday. So do make sure to follow, subscribe, and not miss out on the next episode. Thanks again, and see you next time.
Thank you.